That was a heck of a film, wasn't it? I've seen a lot, and doing research for my book, and just having been attuned to the historical significance. Of course, that's why y'all are here of the event. That's just simply one of the best works I've seen. And Quinn didn't give me $5 to say that, but I just
Thank you. Nor did he give me $5 to say that the book is fantastic. If you haven't read the book, read it. I really think both with the film and the book, you have to kind of pick yourself off the floor finally, and when you realize what was going on in Dallas back then, and the book covers a number of people who are not in this, and you really should read it.
Thank you.
I really believe in knowing the history of the place where we live, and I think it's important to know that.
Thanks.
So we have questions here. Do you want to? Why don't you talk first?
I don't think Dallas is a city of hate, nor was it. Though, if you read my book or take a look at the cover of it, it says Dallas 1963, and there's the infamous image in the back of the flyer, the leaflet that you're aware of, the wanted for treason flyer. But by the way, does anybody know what the penalty for treason is?
Yes.
Death. That flyer was distributed, as you know, probably. It was distributed, thousands of them were distributed around Dallas in anticipation of President Kennedy coming. So someone was accusing him of treason, the penalty of which is death. My quick contention is that there were people in Dallas who were extremely hateful, that we wouldn't be here, there wouldn't be a museum here if that wasn't the case. Now, how many, I don't know, I can't quantify it, but you could see from Quinn's wonderful work and just the pure emotion, the love that was there from a lot of people directed to President Kennedy. So I'm sad to say, Dallas has been objectified, certainly, but there were a lot of people here who loved him and came out to see him, even as a matter of respect. They might have been politically opposed, as one of the folks said, but they knew how important he was and came to offer him respect, and by extension his wife as well. I was in Moscow 30 years after the assassination. That's not Moscow, Texas, but the other one. And I was on an elevator talking to somebody, because it was a long elevator ride. They were trying to speak to me in fractured English and my very fractured Russian, and they asked the same thing, "Where are you from?" I said, "Dallas, Texas," and they just went like this. They said, Kennedy, and they were shooting an imaginary gun, and I felt objectified, at that point many years later. My quick contention...
I do want to interrupt you just by
please.
saying I was somewhere in Eastern Europe, and I can't remember where, and someone asked me where I was from, and I said Dallas, and he went, pish, pish.
Yeah.
So that's your
So
story.
there you go. And just to wrap up quickly, because you want to hear from Quinn, what my contention is in my book, and I think some of this comes across certainly eloquently in Quinn's work, is that Dallas, to use a cliche, the microphone in Dallas, I think, had been hijacked by a handful of people who did not speak for the majority. They happened to be extremely powerful and had access to the microphone. They had access to the airwaves, the pulpits, and frankly, the bank accounts here. To wit, you had the world's richest man, H.L. Hunt, the world's richest man. I just love saying that because I'm not. But he was the world's richest man, and he was bankrolling the anti-Kennedy movement in America, and he happened to work a few blocks from where we're sitting. So he was spending millions of his bucks. This is a guy who believed that the wealthy people in America should be entitled to more votes than you or I, that if you earned a certain amount of money, you should be able to vote 7 times. He despised Kennedy and thought Kennedy was going to take away oil depletion allowances. A few blocks away, you had Reverend Criswell, the most powerful religious figure in the city, the head of First Baptist Church, who disliked Kennedy virulently because he was afraid that Kennedy, really Catholicism, would spell the end of the Protestant faith in America. And he was on record because he was preaching it from the pulpit. So you have the richest guy in town, the spiritual leader a few blocks away, by extension one of my former employers, because I used to work at the Morning News, the head of the Dealey family was running the Dallas Morning News, and he disliked Kennedy enormously. He believed he was weak-willed, was bowing down to the Soviet bear, the Russian bear. He hated him at a personal level. He believed that Kennedy had once had another marriage, and asked his reporters, I'm glad I wasn't working there at the time, he asked his reporters on staff to investigate a rumor that Kennedy had a secret marriage. So it was rather personal. You heard from Congressman Alger, who was very opposed. And there were others. And it just seemed to coalesce in Dallas for fate, circumstance, some awful poetry, if you will. I think there's a question that someone wants to pose to us, why Dallas? And I don't know that I can answer that correctly, other than that there are a lot of things converging here.
Well, I have wrestled with the City of Hate idea for a long time, and when I started, I really started working on this. I tell people I started working on this project 52 years ago, because that was when the first photographs, I took the first photographs that ended up in it. But for the last 30 years, I have interviewed Alger and done some elements that ended up in this. So I've been conscious of it for a long time. But I think the last thing I would have thought of was City of Hate. And as I was reading more letters and going, interviewing people and so forth, I realized that it really did apply. And it's not that the majority of the city was a city of hate, certainly not. I mean, Dallas was a city of good people, but it didn't stop the other views in Dallas, and it let the other views dominate. I mean, Bruce Alger was elected. He represented all of Dallas County, and he was elected 5 times, represented it 10 years. And I'm not going to say he was a hateful person. I think he's a very intellectual person who has definite viewpoints that are probably at odds with most people. But there were so many people in Dallas whose voices dominated. Well, if you want to go to this question, the question was, I'd like to hear your answer on why Dallas.
Yeah, people have asked me that before. Why not Memphis or Los Angeles, places where other tragedies.
Buffalo.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I think it was so profoundly inexplicable, and there had been this collective sense of hope. That's kind of an overused word recently, maybe in presidential politics. I don't know, but there really had been, back then as well, a sense of hope and anticipation, the promise of change. It was an interesting duo. Kennedy from the north and Johnson from the south, and those guys didn't get along all the time. But I think there was some sense that, well, maybe this embodies, some healing and a getting together, and we are moving forward. And so when it happened, it shook, people to the core. I know we could do this here, Quinn. You've done it. We could ask you where you were at that time, and the folks who were alive then will remember precisely, where you were when you heard the news. And I'm not saying it hasn't happened with other events, 9/11 even, and but why it happened in Dallas is I wish I could give you a clear answer other than the one that I attempted to do before. That it just seemed to be that there were these trains leaving from different stations, and they converged here. A religious force, an economic force, a media force, a political force. Quinn's wonderful work showing you and introducing you to General Walker. He was the most powerful member of the military who disliked Kennedy, and he was booted out of the military essentially by Kennedy. He was an ardent member of the John Birch Society, and he could have lived anywhere he wanted in the world, but made a beeline for Dallas, Texas, where a few blocks away, again, he was given the keys to the city by the mayor and welcomed and embraced. He was also given a Stetson hat, the requisite thing you get when you come to Texas. But there it was. You had every leg of the stool, in a sense, represented here, and Dallas became the headquarters of the anti-Kennedy resistance. And I know Quinn wants away, and someone very smart out there has asked a very good question. We have your questions here. We'll try to get to all of them. But how do you explain the fact that it was a leftist and a Marxist? We've talked about this being the right-wing anti-Kennedy, and we'll address that, but I want to let Quinn address why Dallas or...
Well, reading your book makes one thing very clear, and that is that this was not an enlightened city in terms of the people it elected. You point out Earl Cabell had been involved, or at least had been a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. He was the liberal, sort of, who defeated Bruce Alger. You had a very tightly controlled city. As a 13-year, if I, as a 13-year-old, was aware at the time Kennedy came to town that we needed to give him a good welcome, as Howard Weiner, who's in the audience, also mentioned, if I was aware of that, and that I needed to wave extra hard for the president to know, we really like you here, then, the word was out that this was not a hospitable place for Kennedy.
Yeah.
That was different than, Los Angeles, Buffalo, Washington, there's no comparison.
There's something in the Dallas DNA. I think Jim Schutz talked about it a little bit in the film, and other folks too. One of the things I really loved about living in Dallas, I worked for the Dallas Morning News for 20 years. It really is a can-do city. It sounds like a cliche and a Chamber of Commerce statement, but there is a sense here that if you're in Dallas and you believe in change and you believe ardently in it, that you can affect it. And what I think I saw in the early 1960s, prior to Kennedy coming here, was the sense that people here, some of whom lived above the cloud line, had a little bit of money and were connected to politics and the pulpit of the largest Baptist church in America, that they felt they could affect change, not just here, but nationally and even internationally. And why shouldn't we? And if we feel that there's been a moral dereliction in the White House, that Kennedy is on bended knee to the Soviet Union. Again, remember, this is in the middle of the Cold War. We were afraid of being annihilated. And if you feel that Kennedy is going to let that happen, then I think there were folks in Dallas who were saying, we need to do something about it. And we can, because we always have. And Schutz kind of mentioned that we're a city that was built kind of out of nothing, in a sense. This manifest destiny. There's no, great natural resources underneath us right now, no mountaintops, river ports, but Dallas can do stuff. So I think what happened is you had a lot of people saying we could take the national and even international stage and presume to rail against Kennedy, if we need to. We have to. They were driven by a logic. It gets, and I think it is important to ask, it's the question right here, wasn't Oswald a leftist? How does that tie into the political atmosphere at the time? And I'm dominating this, so please.
I just want to say one other thing about Dallas. The evening after Adlai Stevenson, this was just a month before the assassination, the evening after Adlai Stevenson was hit on the head, that was the big story on the CBS Evening News, which was, I believe, it was the first 30-minute national newscast. And Cronkite got on there and devoted about 10 minutes to that story. It was amazing. And he replayed the footage over and over. And since that was said to be the nightly national seance back then, watching the evening news, everybody knew that about Dallas. So, a month before the assassination, the word was out.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. I'm sorry.
No.
Lee Harvey, the leftist.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Again, I think it's a really good question. Because we were sitting here talking about extreme right-wing behavior in Dallas, and so how does that jive with the fact that it was an avowed Marxist leftist who consensus suggests was the one who assassinated the president? And I don't have an answer for that either. That's locked in stone. But I have a theory that Lee Harvey Oswald was a very malleable and impressionable person who really wanted to, in a diluted state, wanted to leave a stamp on history. I think evidence seems to build to that. A lot of psychology seems to point to that. And that you put a guy like that in a hothouse like this, like the thing that we're talking about here, in the days before Kennedy coming especially, there were demonstrations, there were speeches. General Walker gave an unbelievable condemning speech attacking Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson the day before Adlai Stevenson came here and basically, got beat up. Stanley Marcus, in some estimation, saved his life by grabbing the ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, pulling him by a collar into a car where they made a getaway, again, a few blocks away from here. And Stevenson said, "My God, are these humans or are these animals?" Talking about, us in Dallas.
And these are big crowds that
Big
turned
crowd.
out for Edwin Walker.
Exactly. He had a big following. And by the way, one thing that some of you know, history experts, in April of '63, it's generally concluded, April of 1963, that Lee Harvey Oswald had attempted to assassinate someone else in Dallas, up in a nice part of town, lovely part of town off Turtle Creek Boulevard in Highland Park, that he tried to assassinate General Walker. So violence was in the air. Lee Harvey Oswald was seemingly predisposed to violence. He was brutalizing his wife, attempting to assassinate a prominent figure, General Walker. And again, it's easy to connect dots, but my theory is that he was influenced by this hothouse environment, and that might have led him to say, "I need to leave my mark in history, and I'll just do it this way in November."
I agree with you completely. And the motorcade route had not been set when he applied for a job here. He applied at Paget Printing, where he was turned down, which is off the motorcade route. But what you're saying, if I can take you a step further, because I asked myself this question.
Yep.
Therefore, the atmosphere in Dallas may have some responsibility or culpability in the assassination.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It's just, and I don't want to I'm not entitled to give a sermon. I'm probably banned from most churches for all I know. But, we live, and some of these questions touch this, so I hope we're getting to it. Some people have asked here variations on the theme. What is it? What is this polarization about? And is there a parallel to today? That's why I was alluding to the sermon I want to give you for just 15 seconds. We live in a polarized political age. I don't think that's any great thing. You could flip from one channel to the other and have people basically yelling at each other. You know what I mean? Especially on cable news. There's, from this spectrum and over there, and they seem diametrically opposed. And we had a lot of that going on in Dallas at that time, and it just kept welling and welling. And there are obviously a gazillion cautionary lessons about what happened in November in Dallas. But one of them, I think, and this is the sermon part, forgive me, is that no good emerges from this polarization. It escalates from, debate to unreasonable vitriol and then hatred and violence. I think that just happens too often, and it happens too often, I think, everywhere. But that was certainly happening in Dallas. People weren't listening to each other. They were yelling and screaming and being violent. 1963 was just unbelievable. Dr. King came in a little-known visit to Dallas in 1963. It's sort of been forgotten and lost to history. There's some suggestion that his advisors, just like Adlai Stevenson's advisors, had told him, "Don't come to Dallas. It's too hot there. It's too dangerous." Obviously courageous, came to Dallas anyway, delivered a speech downtown. Prior to the speeches, minutes before he was to appear at the auditorium, there was a bomb threat. A bomb threat had been lodged. And there's some belief that it had been lodged by members of the American Nazi Party, who were prevalent and mingling and working in town. General Walker, the leader, sort of the titular leader of the anti-Kennedy movement, living on Turtle Creek Boulevard, his primary aide, his aide-de-camp, was a key figure in the American Nazi Party. So it sounds kind of nutty, and you heard folks talking about the Ku Klux Klan being here and at work. Former Mayor Thornton, for whom the highway is named, had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So these are folks who are out and about and here, and it just, things went from bad to worse.
Brother Minutaglio, I endorse your sermon. Okay. I'm in, because a number of people have asked me sort of like, well, what conclusion do I draw after working on this film? And I think the main thing is that words matter. I think they mattered back then. That's what your book's about, really.
That's really well said.
And the polarization, the thing about polarization is it's fine to have two sides. You know, we all agree that's great. But right now you have a situation where a small minority of one party is driving that party. And so where does that leave the other party and the people in the middle and all that? And that's very similar to Dallas, I think, in that a small group of people was driving what was heard from the city anyway. I'm glad you're reading the questions.
Well,
'Cause
no,
I left my glasses
I'm
in
going to
the car.
direct this one to you as if we're on, I'm now interviewing you, but I think this is a question that I was complimenting Quinn a lot before, during the film and right now. It just was really just brilliantly done. And I'm jealous because you succeeded in doing something that I was not able to do, which was to find Bruce Alger and then to interview him, who was obviously a pivotal figure at the time. He was, sort of the political face of the Kennedy opposition. He was the most strident anti-Kennedy member and probably the most strident right-wing member. That's an observation, not a pejorative, by the way. I'm just saying it's an observation. He was the most strident member of Congress, perhaps. He was the only guy in Congress, by the way, who had voted, this is from either side of the aisle, against giving away free surplus milk to poor children in America. Every person in Congress, right and left, said, yeah, we got surplus milk, let's give it to kids. Alger said no because he thought it was godless communism. But the question is, why did Alger agree to interview with you? And does he have any idea, this is pretty intense, how crazy he sounds, particularly in 2014 or 2013, perhaps?
Yeah, I don't know about the second part of it. The first part, I think, is kind of interesting. I called him 30 years ago when it was the 20th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. I was a reporter at Channel 4 at the time, and I just thought, well, this would be interesting, see what Bruce Alger has to say about the Kennedy assassination on the 20th anniversary. And he had an office over at Campbell Center on Northwest Highway, and he talked to me and he was very cordial, and I told him what I wanted to do, and he was fine. So I went over there, and he, just like today, he sort of let her rip. And he was very polite. He's a very nice person. And I hadn't talked to him in 30 years, but I tracked him down in Florida. He was living in literally a double-wide house, manufactured house, which he's moved out of since then. And I reminded him about that interview, and he remembered it. And he thought it was fair. And, I told him, I said, I'm not going to agree with you necessarily. I just want to talk to you. And he agreed to it. So I went out there, drove up to his place, and there's something I respect about him in that, I think he is an idea person. I don't necessarily agree with his ideas. I think he was consistent. He's intelligent, and he was a war hero. He led 23 bombing missions over Japan. I had an uncle who was also a B-29 commander, and I think that's something you just have to acknowledge in someone's life. But having said that, he wanted me to distribute with him his book about his B-29 experience. It was a self-published book, and he said, great, you can take Texas, and you can take half or whatever. I said, no, I'm not in that business. But in the back of his book, in big block letters, it says, no more war, which I was just shocked to see that idea come from Bruce Alger. And he meant it, but his method was basically to intimidate all other countries with our nuclear weapons until they disarmed. But I think he knows he was not well liked in his days in Congress. So that's why he agreed to it.
Good. I'm going to keep posing questions to
Yep.
you, and I can weigh in if you like. What responsibility, if any, did the Citizens Council, the Dallas Citizens Council, have in creating the climate in the city?
Why don't you start on that one?
Well, they had enormous influence. Some people, just real quickly, the Dallas Citizens Council, I think, so wonderfully described by the one of the anthropologists in the film, was really a group of 25 or so members, almost all of them men. I think every single one of them men at the time, who were the city elders, and they came from different walks of life, insurance, banking, politics, and they would simply gather as city elders to talk about the direction, the fate of the city. Some people said they would gather to decide who the mayor would be. Invariably, the person they wanted would become the mayor, and it's still around. It's still here. I'm just saying this as a reporter. When I first moved here in 1983, I remember interviewing somebody in South Dallas who said to me, I asked their opinion of the Dallas Citizens Council, and they said, "You mean the Dallas White Citizens Council?" So that maybe gives you some context.
That must have been Al Lipscomb.
Well,
Was it?
No, it was just a guy,
Okay.
not an elected official, but I think, perhaps emblematic of how some folks felt.
Yeah.
Power might be tightly controlled among a few people in the city. I don't know that that's really distinct, by the way, in other cities, but Dallas back then, folks would meet. I keep pointing to saying a few blocks from where we're sitting, but it's true. They would meet downtown on the top floors of some of the bank buildings and talk about things. The thing that they were talking about in this time period was, again, eloquently described in the film, integration, and what the economic consequence of that would be. Is it going to be bad for business? That was really being talked about. I think there were certainly members of it, folks there, including Stanley Marcus, who in our book is quite a hero, along with a few other lesser-known folks. Juanita Craft, some of you might remember from Dallas, Reverend H. Rhett James, who was the leader of the largest black church in Dallas. There were folks here who were kind of moving against the impulses of the Dallas Citizens Council to go very low and slow in terms of integrating public schools. Dallas, at the time period in the early 60s, was the largest American city to not yet integrate its schools. I was surprised to learn that. I pegged it to be somewhere in the deeper South, but here you go. And so you think about that. There was a lot of anxiety in the air. A lot of it stirred up by the media that was resisting, the mainstream media, that is. The two big papers, the Times Herald and Morning News, really resisting what was going on. And the Morning News, by the way, was considered sort of the mouthpiece of the Dallas Citizens Council. So its editorials were almost coming from the top of the bank buildings at the meetings then there. And they were espousing a resistance to Kennedy, and then a resistance to these, what some would call socially progressive endeavors, and others would call, socialism. So the Citizens Council, in retrospect, and members of it have said later, I wish we had done more. I wish we had done more to tamp down the extremist edges. I wish we had done more to move some things forward so that this hothouse, edgy environment hadn't existed. There was a realization. I hope you saw that Dallas at the Crossroads footage in Quinn's work. It's online. The full Dallas Crossroads movie is online. You can see it on YouTube, and it's actually really interesting. It was Dallas's attempt, I think too late in the game, to begin softening the edges. So I think there's been some Monday morning quarterbacking about the Citizens Council. Maybe it could have done more to put a bomb, B-A-L-M, on the city, the anger here.
Let me say this about the Citizens Council. It started after we heard about the 1936 Texas Centennial. There was a 1937 exposition that was a repeat of it, and it was not very successful. And R.L. Thornton, who led Mercantile Bank and later became mayor, wanted to get together a permanent group of what he called a yes-no group, where you could get executives together. It's hard to do this today, but get executives together who could commit their companies yes or no on any issue, just at the table. And that group, amazingly, chose everybody in government, almost everyone in government, until the 70s. And they would appoint the slate for the school board, and they won every time until about 1970. They appointed everyone on the city council. Oddly enough, Earl Cabell ran against the Citizens Council and won, and I don't really know why that was. And then Wes Wise ran against the Citizens Council candidate. But it was, and all the positions were at large on the school board and the city council, so electively, this group of business people, these very powerful business people, controlled government. I mean, they absolutely controlled local government, which is, amazing today to think of that.
Yeah, and I think historians have looked back and said, should they have done more? Should they have met more often and more aggressively to anticipate, what had happened in November? I don't know how you could do that, but maybe just think harder and have some sort of a grid or plan to introduce change in a better way, and again, turn down the temperature in the city. They certainly knew. I was mentioning in January of '63, there was a bomb threat against Dr. King in Dallas. He persisted in delivering an unbelievably eloquent speech, basically saying, "What can we please get along?" So he was speaking directly to Dallas, city that he had been warned against. In April, just a few months later, Oswald sneaks into General Walker's backyard off Turtle Creek Boulevard and comes this close to killing him. The bullet grazed General Walker's head, fired into his house, hit the windowsill that parted his hair, literally. Should the Dallas Citizens Council have taken note, the police have taken note, and conducted a more intense investigation, maybe they would have found Lee Harvey Oswald if he indeed was the one who tried to assassinate Walker, and then have obviously stopped what had happened in November. When you look at the history of Dallas in 1963, it's when someone should have been turning the thermostat one way, it was just going the other way. There was a gentleman in town who had been a Holocaust survivor, Jack Oren, who had been a victim of torture by Dr. Mengele, and had been going out around town giving talks about his experience surviving these awful experiments. He came home one night in the spring of '63 and found a cross burning on his lawn. 2 children were arrested in Fort Worth, children, 12 and 13, I believe, on their way to blow up a temple. And they were wearing Nazi armbands. And it just kept getting, it built to this moment in October that Quinn showed you, where Adlai Stevenson was attacked. He was spit upon and caused the ambassador to say, "Are these animals?" And then something needed to be done. And I think there was a lot of soul searching later on at the Citizens Council. What could we have done? It's awful to condemn folks for inaction, and because no one could have predicted, but there were warning signs.
Yeah, and they did. I mean, they clearly moved too slow on desegregation of schools. I don't know if you picked up on this in the film because it was really a minor part, but the Roosevelt High School, when Lisa Hembry went to Roosevelt High School, it was opened that year, 1963, as a segregated school, as what the Dallas School District called at the time, Dallas Negro High School. And how did that happen 9 years after the Brown decision?
These questions are all great. I applaud you. There's one that asks, and I'm not giving the names. I don't know if people want me to, but some of you wrote your names. But the question is, some say the assassination forced Dallas to change and actually become a more open-minded city. In this respect, folks would argue that it was good for Dallas. Do you agree that the assassination in some way was good? I suppose the idea being that it was cathartic, or it caused Dallas to change for the good.
I'm going to take sort of a minority position on this. I don't think so. I think we were embarrassed, and we wanted people to like us, and we wanted people to say, "No, we're really not like that," and that was fine. But after the assassination, what happened? But the Citizens Council picked a new mayor without even when Earl Cabell resigned to run for Congress. The Citizens Council picked a new mayor without even going to the city council. They went to Eric Johnson at Texas Instruments and said, "We want you to be mayor," and he didn't want to do it. And so that control continued. I was in high school. I graduated in 1969. That was the first, 68, 69, it was the first year we had black students in that high school. And it was the first year that we played football games with all the schools in Dallas. And, that was 1969. That's crazy. We were behind. And I don't think we did a very good job. And I think I don't think it was a Kennedy assassination. I think it was just the natural progression of the city, the diversity of the city. I mean, the city matured. It has a much more diverse population, diverse in all sorts of ways. And I happen to think it's a wonderful city right now, but I think it just took time.
I think some of the really extreme outer edges faded away, were forced to go away. The one again in the film, the National Indignation Committee, that was headquartered here. It was created here. It was headquartered here. They were virulently anti-Kennedy. They hated Bobby Kennedy too. They led a very vigorous protest against Bobby Kennedy when he, as Attorney General, came to speak at the Sheraton Hotel. They very ominously created a kind of like circling the wagons. They had cars circling the Sheraton Hotel very ominously. It was very scary, probably for Bobby Kennedy. They described themselves as being right of the John Birch Society. They accused the John Birch Society of being liberal. And so here they were, pretty intense guys. They kind of went away. So I think some of the really rough-edged customers out there, people who were completely unreasonable. Again, even these fringe folks, the American Nazi Party, neo-Nazis at work in Dallas.
But in your book,
some
you point
of
out
them went away.
you point out these. I mean, the people who did the indignation committee, they were drawn to Dallas for that reason. Right?
Yeah, Dallas became a destination point. People were moving here to join what they thought was a mission or a war against Kennedy. They literally were relocating here, seeking jobs here, but directing sort of their political efforts to overthrowing Kennedy. It was the headquarters. Okay, we have one more. Boy, you're all going to be, I'd be glad to stay and answer any of these that we didn't get to, but I think we got to that. Here's a good question. What, if anything, was Oswald's connection to the anti-Kennedy elements in Dallas mentioned in the film? What, if anything, was Oswald's connections to the anti-Kennedy elements that we've, I guess, been talking about, Quinn? It's directed to you as well.
I'm going to beg off in the sense that I'm not addressing that in the film.
Right.
I'm not addressing Oswald or the cause. I mean, I have my own theories about Oswald, and I think they're backed up by the evidence. But I really don't even think it's that interesting. I think Oswald, he was a very strange case who just ended up here.
I think. We didn't arrange this ahead of time, but you'll notice that Lee Harvey Oswald is absent. You'll notice it absent really in both of our works, because I think there's other folks who've said what can be said, and we were talking coincidentally about a climate and a place and time. There's some evidence that Oswald was reading a lot of the anti-Kennedy literature. It's just, there's evidence of that, and was certainly aware of it. As I said earlier, I think he was just, inspired is the wrong word. I think he was an impressionable person, and the things that were happening in Dallas, the mood, the climate here, the things that he was reading religiously in the papers, and influenced him in some way. That's, again, armchair psychology, but that's about my best answer. We have just real quickly a question about, not much has been made of the fact that Oswald was born in New Orleans and he only lived in Texas perhaps 2 years before the assassination. Most of that was in Fort Worth. I don't know that it's actually a good observation, and so I'm just reading it out loud. That's all true. Dallas, perhaps the extension of that is that Dallas inherited Oswald very unfortunately. There is another question here. Have we read a book named Dr. Mary's Monkey, which we think...
I have not.
I have not either. I think it's a conspiracy-oriented book. Many of them are out there. And then, last but not least, I think we kind of talked about this. Wouldn't you agree that the right-wing media today has created today's polarized politics, which has created another climate of hate against perhaps President Obama, So,
I want to say something about that
Please.
because I think, whether you like Obama or don't, I really think that a lot of the criticism about him has been that he is not legitimate. And it goes, whether it has to do with his birth certificate or whether he was born in Kenya or whatever, or who his family is, it has to do with a lack of legitimacy. And a lot of this was going on in 1963, before 1963, in regard to Kennedy and his Catholicism. We tend not to think about Catholicism as being strange, but the Irish and the Catholics were in a very similar position to other minorities later, and I think there's a lot of similarities.
it's really eloquent. I met a retired auto worker in Detroit on my book tour who said to me, "You should call your book America 2013, because the same things happen and people are yelling at each other, they're yelling at Obama." I wrote a book about George W. Bush. I wrote the first biography of George W. Bush, and I could tell you that he was assailed in pretty vitriolic ways too. So we live in a polarized environment again. That's going back to my sermonizing, but it's something, and I'm part of the media, we both are, we're culpable of it. The last thing that kind of ties in, maybe we answered it, I don't know. Why do you think people stoop to narrow-minded overgeneralizations and then resort to the blame game when tragedies occur?
That sounds like a dissertation topic or something.
It does, yeah. We're not psychologists, but it's always good to indict yourself and be self-effacing. The media has something to do with that, I think, because we like to see things in black and white too often, and sometimes we reduce things to generalizations.
I just think, I hope you read this book. It's really a wonderful book, depressing in places, but actually very entertaining. And you see how the characters, if I may call them that, who are depicted, I don't think they could be imagined. A lot of them are strange. They're people on the edge, and yet they carried weight somehow. They filled, these strange characters on the edge filled Memorial Auditorium, and were passing out leaflets, and took out the big ad in the Dallas Morning News, which I've never really made that much of a big deal about. I think Bill covers it very well, and there's an interesting story about it. But I'm thinking, I don't know that anyone read it or it made any difference on anything, but it is an indication of what advertising the morning news took.
Right. When you can see from Quinn's great work, this is a mutual admiration society, you can see this, but the Dallas was like a stage, like a theater. Picture going into a theater, and then these people populated the stage. They walked on it, and each one of them was more intense, interesting, problematic than the next. And then the last figure to emerge, almost as a consequence of all the drama, the acting, the posturing, the anger, all of the emotion before, was Lee Harvey Oswald. And then shots rang out.
He was the late arrival.
He was the late arrival, the last protagonist in a way.
Well, thank you all for coming and
Thank you for
listening to us.